Hey, what's up you guys? The Curious Owl here, and today I will be sharing with you guys my October wrap-up. So many of you know October was a crazy month for me. I got married as of 2 days ago, as of the day I am recording this, and I was actually surprised with how much I was able to read over the course of the month. I ended up reading, I think, a few more books than I had anticipated because towards like the middle of the month, I started kind of getting in a groove with reading, and then by the time that the end of the month rolled around, I had pretty much finished quite a few books I had planned on, but still had not really finished all of the books that I had wanted. I will say too, please excuse if you see any wet spots on my shirt or my face is all red. I've just gotten out of the shower, so that's why I look like a bit of a mess. Today we're gonna go over the books I had read for the month of October, and in the month of October I read a total of 9 books, which is way more than I had expected. When it comes to the stats for the month, I read a total of 1,767 physical pages and listened to 15 hours, 34 minutes, and 35 seconds worth of audiobook. I read 7 physical books, no ebooks, 2 audiobooks, and 7 of the books I read this month were from my personal library and 2 were borrowed from the library. Also in the month, I basically had my star ratings go as follows. I had 2 books that were 5 stars, 5 books that were 4 stars, 1 book that was 3 stars, 1 book that was 2 stars, no 1 stars, but I actually did have 3 DNFs, so I actually went through about 12 books in the month, but I only ended up actually finishing 9, and I only count the books finished for however many total I go through the month. So now let's get into the ratings for each book that I read over the course of the month. So the first one I read was Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. This is the 3rd book in the Grisha trilogy. I buddy read this with my friend Princess over at Castle Library, and I was so surprised with how the ending of this book went, because when I read Siege and Storm in April of 2020, I was a little disappointed with how the story went, because I thought that the first half was pretty boring. It didn't really have a lot going on, and then the second half was actually really interesting because once I got to meet Nikolai, oof, things really went well. I was so happy. I love Nikolai as a character, and I think I loved him even more in Ruin and Rising, so much so to the point that I really would like to get my hands on King of Scars as soon as I possibly can. I really loved Ruin and Rising because I think overall the ending was better than I had expected, but it was still surprising. I had accidentally spoiled myself for the ending for Mal and Alina specifically because I went to check the amount of pages that was in the back of the book and accidentally spoiled myself for them. But I did not know going into it what was to be expected with what happened with the Darkling. And funny enough, Princess knew what was supposed to happen to the Darkling and didn't know what was supposed to happen to Alina and Mal. And Princess and I kind of agreed in the same sense that the way that the Darkling story ended was not necessarily bad, but was not what we expected and was not what we had hoped for with the Darkling by any means. There's a lot of characters I feel like that in this book though I really grew appreciative of, one of them being the Darkling. I think as dark and dangerous and really kind of a jerk as he is, the Darkling is a character that I think is really interesting to look at, and I would truthfully like to see something come out of it where we get more of a backstory on the Darkling, because one of the things I think I dislike about the series, if I was to say I disliked anything other than the pacing of Siege and Storm, is that I feel like we didn't really get the entire picture of the Darkling. I feel like he is a guy who is, you know, evil at his core, but I would like to have seen a little bit more of a backstory with him, because we only know that basically he essentially like took over this power and he became very corrupted because of it. But I want to know more specifically about how he grew up, like how he and his mother were, who was a very integral part of the story. You know, I want to know more about what he was like when he was learning his abilities and how exactly he became dark, because I think that would have not necessarily like empathized with the character more, but I think you would understand why exactly he became who he is, and why in particular he kind of has this weird back and forth with Alina, because he almost makes it seem like he's in love with her, but he's not. He's really only using her for her power, but he also may have some weird feelings for her. So I feel like, weird enough, as much as everybody does not like the idea of like the main love interest of any story having their own story from their perspective, like they do with Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer, I feel like I almost want a book though from the Darkling's perspective from when he was a child all the way up to Ruin and Rising. And I feel like that I'm so torn because I really did not like the idea of like Midnight Sun being how it was, but I feel like I'm such a hypocrite because I want one just like that story structure wise for the Darkling. So I don't know. I love the ending of this book though. I think that it was a really stellar ending to a series, but still left so much open for the world because we met quite a few characters that do come up within the other books in the world with like Six of Crows that I think would be very interesting to delve into. And then obviously, like I said, we see Nikolai in the King of Scars series, and I would really like to see how Nikolai is in that because I feel like I'm of the mindset that Alina could have been with anybody. She could have been with the Darkling. She could have been with Nikolai. She could have been with Mal. I was more of a Mal person because I think he was a sweetheart, but I totally would have supported her being with Nikolai. Like, he was definitely my second choice because he was fiery. He was hot. He was just, oof. Nikolai could get it. So then the next book I completed was the Aenid by Vergil. This was a random TBR pick from, I think, June, and I finally finished it. I finally got through it this month, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I thought it was really good. This is one of those stories where I feel like you couldn't just read it, you couldn't just listen to it on an audiobook. You would have to literally watch this story happen. There's a reason why there's so many Greek stories that are done through plays, because that's the only way you can understand sometimes what the hell is going on. Now, Vergil wasn't necessarily like fully back in ancient Greece, but he was like a little bit older, and his story is basically very synonymous with the Odyssey, which is a Greek story. The Aeneid is kind of the Roman version of the Odyssey, if you will. There are some differences. There are some like major like changes between the two, but the Aeneid is basically considered the Roman version of the Odyssey because there's very, very similar things that happen in both stories. I really enjoyed my time reading it, and I think that after having read each of the cliff notes basically after every part of this book, it definitely made the reading experience a little bit more interesting. I think that it's not necessarily something I would recommend for younger readers. I don't understand necessarily why they would read it in high school because I feel like it's a little bit too much, but I do understand that they would teach it because it's a classic work, and a lot of times most teachers will have you look at the cliff notes or the spark notes in order to understand what the hell's going on, or they will tell you as the story's progressing what is going on. So then the first audiobook I finished for the month was Winter Counts by David Heska Wanbli Weiden. I do not know how to pronounce that name. I apologize for butchering it. This, though, is basically an Indigenous story written by an Indigenous author that's supposed to be kind of a political thriller of sorts because it deals with a man who is living on the Sioux Reservation, I think. I think it's based in North Dakota. I cannot remember for the life of me which tribe it is, and that is so bad of me. But basically, this is about a vigilante Indigenous person who takes things into his own hands sometimes when it comes to like the crime that goes on the reservation. And unfortunately for him, when he is raising his nephew after his sister passes away in a car accident, he finds out his nephew basically overdoses on heroin. And the nephew's never really been someone who would normally do this. He kind of was pressured into it, but he does end up helping the police and the FBI with finding out who is bringing these drugs into the reservation and threatening basically the livelihood of the teenagers and other people within the reservation. There's a lot of other political events that kind of happen over the course of the story, but here's my thing. The way that the story was marketed was that it was kind of more supposed to be a mystery thriller, I think, but it doesn't really have many thrilling aspects. Like, I liked the story, do not get me wrong. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, but the reason it was only a 4 was that I felt like while the story in itself was captivating and was actually very thrilling in the terms of like the political intrigue that went on within this reservation and this town, there wasn't really anything thrilling about it otherwise. There wasn't really any high stakes. It didn't seem like there was a lot of things happening that needed to be solved like right away, like most mystery thrillers kind of do. So it's very slow. It's very kind of watching things progress. And truthfully, I don't necessarily feel like that the main character is all that appealing in a lot of ways. I feel like people just are not going to connect with him very well because, I mean, he is a vigilante of sorts, but he doesn't really have a lot of substance to him. And I feel like the more that I've kind of moved away from this, the more I kind of just don't remember much because there wasn't really a lot that was memorable about it until like the big reveal at the end, which was a big reveal. Don't get me wrong. It was very kind of out of left field and left me very like drawn back. But when after the big reveal happened and we kind of look back at the story of what exactly had happened to lead everybody to this point, it did make sense. So it's not that the big reveal is necessarily completely out of left field where it doesn't make sense. It's out of left field in the sense that you don't necessarily understand what's happening until somebody tells you what's happening, and then you're like, oh, that's why this was happening, kind of thing. And then everything starts to make sense. I think it was good, but I think that there's a lot of issues I have with, you know, these political thrillers sometimes where like there's no other thrilling aspects to it. Like the other one I would compare it to is like the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series, the Millennium series by Stieg Larsson, where those are political thrillers in the sense that they actually have other substances to them that make them thrilling. Like there's other points that make it more of a thrilling story, whereas Winter Counts is more of like basically this investigation that's going on. You're seeing it develop, and then you realize there's some political aspect to it that you're like, oh, this is deeper than it seems to be. The next book I finished was A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. This is a collection of 3 short stories dealing with a person by the name of Dunk, who is basically Sir Duncan. He is a giant. He basically is like over 6 feet tall, so most people consider him to be of like a giant nature, like there are dwarves. There is giantism and then there's dwarfism. Dunk is basically what's considered a giant. And in the beginning of the first story, we find out that his person that he was a squire for has passed away. And so Sir Dunk is basically what's called a hedge knight, where he basically can go off and sign off to whoever, you know, he wants to for any particular amount of time. He could do, you know, a few things for them and then basically go on his merry way. He's not necessarily a mercenary. Like, he is a pretty decent guy. He's not someone who's going to just go kill off people for somebody as a hedge knight, but he is someone who is willing to lay down his arms for the right person and help them with when they are in need of help. And while on his travels in the first story, Sir Duncan meets a little boy named Egg, and we find out that Egg has a very mysterious past about him that I do not want to reveal because it does spoil a lot of the first story. But basically this collection of 3 stories does go through the travels of Dunk and Egg, as Egg does become Sir Duncan's page and his squire basically, and they just go on a bunch of travels together. It's 3 short stories about the different adventures of Sir Duncan and a little Egg. I really liked this. I think in general the stories were really good. I think that though this is not something you need to necessarily read, it does take place 90 years, I believe, before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire or the Game of Thrones series, as most people know it. But does it really matter if you read this when you've read the rest of the series? Does it add anything? It adds to the world, it adds to the lore. There are mentions of like the current rulers during the time of Sir Duncan and what's going on politically in some ways. But other than that, there's not much that's added to the story. You just kind of learn about one of the stories that a lot of people will tell in like the Song of Ice and Fire series. Now, I will say that this kind of compares in the sense of my sentiments about Fire and Blood, where Fire and Blood is kind of just an additional kind of thing adding to the story, adding to the lore. It is very much for someone who is very invested in the world, wants to read everything. But to the common reader, this is not something that I think is absolutely necessary to read. I like the stories by themselves, but I felt like the stories were a little disjointed. I felt like with especially the second story, I couldn't tell if it was supposed to be towards the tail end of Sir Duncan's like whole knighthood thing, like his knighthood story, or if it was supposed to be the first, second, and third stories were pretty linear. There was just a large gap of time between them. I couldn't really tell, so I felt like the stories were a little disjointed to where it made it a little bit confusing here and there, but overall they were pretty good, and I rated the entire collection a 4 out of 5 stars. So then the next book was another short story collection that I read, and that was Night Shift by Stephen King. I do have a full video that is a reading vlog and review of this book, so I will leave that down in the description for you guys, as I'm not going to really talk about it much here. I've been doing this thing recently where if I do any reading vlog reviews for either my Stephen King books or for my Thirst Reread series, those will be in the description every month so that you guys can just go watch those, because I give all of my thoughts on the books in those videos, and I don't feel like it's that important to go through the entirety of them again. But I will say the whole collection basically got a 4 out of 5 stars for me. I really like this one a lot, and I'm excited to hopefully be able to watch one of the movies that was made off of like Graveyard Shift, which is one of the stories in here. The next 2 books I read were part of my Thirst Reread series by Christopher Pike, which were books Phantom and Evil Thirst, which were books 4, 5, and 6 6 of the series. I also have videos for those books down in the description below if you would like to hear my thoughts on those. I will say Phantom was pretty good. It was a 4-star. And then Evil Thirst was pretty disappointing, and it ended up being 2 stars. But if you want to know how my thoughts were in totality of these 2 books, especially of Evil Thirst, if you've read the series, you might want to go check out those videos because Evil Thirst was a huge letdown. The next book that I tried to read and DNF'd was Sabriel by Garth Nix. This was my random TBR pick for, I believe, August, and truthfully, I couldn't tell you necessarily what I didn't like about it. I just felt like I couldn't get into the story. I didn't like necessarily the writing style of this. I felt like it was way too hard for me to understand. It took me 5 times to read the same page, and I could not still tell you after 5 times of reading the same page what the hell was even going on. And the next book I DNF'd was 26 Kisses by Anna Michaels. Again, another random TBR pick. I think this one was for my September TBR, and did not like this. I thought it was really annoying. I felt like I just did not like the main character right off the bat. And typically if I don't like a main character right off the bat, so much to the point where I wanted to throttle her, then I'm not going to read the book. Now, the next book I did also DNF, but this one not for any particular reason. I think I just am not someone who is able to read historical text at the moment, and I think this is one I will go back to. It's just not something I think I was able to really get in the mood for at this time, and that was Catherine the Great by Robert K. Massey. This was my random TBR pick for October, I believe. And this is basically like a historical text. Like, it's basically telling the story of Catherine the Great, who was a princess, I think, of Russia, if I'm not mistaken. And it basically was supposed to be a fictionalized almost account of what her life was like from birth to death, essentially, and her reign and all of these things. I just don't think that at the time I picked this up, I was really in the mood to read anything historical. And I don't know, I feel like when it comes to certain areas, like I found this book randomly and I kept it because I thought I might have some interest in it. But I feel like unless I hear a lot of people talk about it, it's not something I'm necessarily interested in terms of like wanting to read a historical book. So I'm gonna hold on to it for right now. I may come back to it, but it's not necessarily gonna be a high priority. But I think if I hold on to it for more than a couple more months and still don't get around to reading it, I think I'm just going to unhaul it because I feel like this is one of those books where I feel like I might want to give it a chance, but I'm still not 100% certain, and I don't want to necessarily make a decision right now until I know I'm absolutely sure I'm not going to try again with it. The next book I completed was my second and last audiobook for the month, which was Burnt Mountain by Anne Rivers Siddons. This was my library lottery pick for October, and this is like, it's literary fiction, basically, is what I will say. So literary fiction for a lot of people is hit or miss. This was okay. Like, I kind of got the gist of it, but then it just took a really weird turn towards like the second half of the book that I was like just completely confused by. The whole point of the story, I think, is to watch this woman who has had a lot of things happen to her, has basically been ridiculed by her mother almost her whole life for being a tomboy, and she goes through all these things, and like you see her go to college, and she meets this professor that she really ends up loving and having she has a relationship with, ends up getting married to him. And after her grandmother passes away, she moves into, with her husband, this house that her grandmother had owned, and it's also reminiscent of a lot of past trauma that this character had gone to. So it's a very weird situation where she's, you know, obviously her grandmother passing away was really hard on her, and also there's a lot of past trauma associated with the house that she's going to be living in, and then her mother also passes away, and so there's a lot of unresolved trauma that goes through in that part. And then about halfway through the book, we start realizing her husband starts to go a little crazy because he is a lover and a studier of Celtic myth, and he is an Irishman. He's from Ireland, and he gets involved with the local like campground area that a lot of kids go to for summer camp, and starts telling these Celtic stories, and he basically just goes batshit crazy. I think that's the part that I just completely like was very much like, what the hell am I reading? Like, I felt like I was going to be reading this book about a woman who's gone through a lot of trauma, that was going to, you know, try to find her way back to a normal existence after having, you know, some things from her traumatic past now be gone from her life, or, you know, having to reopen some wounds, you know, that she had dealt with in childhood or whatever. And that was about the first half of the book, and then her husband goes batshit crazy and becomes some Celtic madman. I have nothing against it, but why the hell would this come up? And where did we go? How did we get from point A to Z? Because I've lost the entire trail. Like, that's basically how I felt. I think it wasn't necessarily bad, but I was very confused, and I feel like I might have a better chance of understanding that descent if I read the physical book, because I did get lost a lot in the audiobook, so I feel like that may have had something to do with it. I don't know. It was just weird, but I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because I was intrigued. And then the last book that I read and completed, which actually was a book that my therapist recommended I read, is Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristin Neff. This is a book that talks about self-compassion, which is apparently a study of psychology that a lot of people don't really talk about, which is because a lot of people don't like the idea of talking about taking care of themselves. We have a very huge stigma in the United States about, self-care and how we need to take care of others before ourselves. And this is a book that basically lays out everything in terms of how self-compassion can help in various areas of life, such as with relationships with your spouses or other romantic partners, how self-compassion can help you with your productivity, with your work life, all kinds of areas. And my therapist recommended this for me because I have a very hard time being self-compassionate. I am someone who is a very type A individual where I'm very organized. I do things, very particularly. I have a little bit of a anxiety when it comes to when things don't necessarily go the way I expect them. I don't give myself a lot of grace when it comes to when things don't turn out the way I plan it. And that is one of the things I'm trying to work on with therapy. And so my therapist basically thought that by reading something in this way and really studying these concepts, that it would help me to better understand my own self, because I am someone who is more apt to understanding information when I read it. So she thought that this would be a great way for me to try to understand these concepts, and has since today I had another therapy appointment, recommended that I read another book that kind of looks into a concept of basically self-compassion, self-love, self-care, things of that nature, being able to be present in moments and understand that not everything, necessarily is going to be a bad thing if it does turn out bad by itself. Like, if you plan something and it doesn't go right, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and you shouldn't beat yourself up about it. Give yourself some grace and take care of yourself when you are feeling, in times of real stress. And I will say, I read this in about 3 days. It's a fairly short book, but I, as you can see, tabbed it up to filth. I also tabbed up here some of the exercises that are recommended in this book. This is something that I think everyone who is in psychology, is taking therapy, is going through any kind of massive change, is going through any kind of struggle should read, because I gained so much insight about myself through this book, because it's a mix of anecdotes with actual studies that the author has done themselves and studies that they have researched about different areas of self-compassion and how different kinds of people are about self-compassion in terms of whether they think that it's, something that they can do. There's a lot of studies about self-compassion and people who, have positive relationships where, they're in loving relationships, or how their friendships are. Basically, it's a really interesting mix of, real life stories that the author has herself, with going through and learning about self-compassion and going through her own spiritual and emotional journey as she became a psychologist. And it also does, like I said, cite a lot of information from various studies that have been done on self-compassion, since she's kind of the pioneer of it. It's very, very awesome. I love this book so much, and this is something I think I'm definitely going to pick up time and time again. Like, I'm going to tell you, probably in the next few years, this spine is going to be completely cracked. You're going to see lines and lines in this spine, because this is something I truly feel in my heart I'm going to constantly refer back to when I'm feeling really down on myself. There you guys go. Those are the books that I read over the course of the month of October. Again, much, much more than I had expected, and I'm very proud of myself that I have done so. I do have quite a few books I do plan on reading in November, but as I've said before in my update video before I got married, I am not planning on posting one, because right now I just want to get through the rest of my books that I would like to read over the course of the year. And then going into January, I do hope to get my D&D based TBR game ready and out to everybody. So I really want to spend more time working with that and working out the kinks with it. So I don't want to post a TBR right now because truthfully, the only things I want to read at this point are like my Stephen King reads, my Thirst Reread series, and then pretty much anything else that I fancy. I will say, I do plan on reading The Witcher over the course of this month. So there's that. And then The Burning God comes out on the 17th, which I'm so excited about. And, you know, there's some other things here that I would like to read over the course of the month that I see on my library cart off screen here. But I don't know, you guys are going to have to see at the end of November what I ended up reading over the course of the month. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. Let me know how your guys' month went in October, if you read a lot, if you didn't read as much, what you're planning to read in November. I would love, love, love to know. And if you guys haven't already and you'd like to be, hit the button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.